Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for joining. And on behalf of this phenomenal organization, Movable Feast, I'm very, very happy to be here this evening. My name is Andre Robinson. I'm a producer, father. I'm a writer and community developer and real estate developer here in West Baltimore. And I'm very pleased and honored to be able to speak to you on behalf of an organization that I would have to say it moved from admiration to actually sort of love and deep abiding respect. I met Movable Feast many years ago when I was shooting a television show in Baltimore about social innovation that was created by my cousin, AJ Ali. And when I heard how many meals they were serving from this place and who they were serving, we actually just couldn't believe it. 750,000 meals, I think, a year at that point. So we went to have a day of service there and just saw this incredible operation depending on these phenomenal volunteers and other professionals coming in to do this work. And I've been a long admirer of theirs. And so I'm really happy that you all are able to join us this evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit and hopefully get very quickly to your questions about this sense of this moment where we are, and I won't bore everybody because unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you know what's happening globally and around the world. But where do we go from here? Now we know, for the most part, what the impact of this worldwide crisis is going to be. But the upside of actually working in Baltimore is that you get to see that these communities were in crisis already and have been for many generations. I've only been working in Baltimore off and on for about 10 years, initially to do the show. And I came back after the uprising after Freddie Gray's murder to work on a project called Innovation Village, which required a very deep scan of both the assets, the obstacles, and the opportunities in Baltimore for revitalization and redevelopment. Over the 35-year course of my career, I've worked in 7 other cities, not in Baltimore, actually rebuilding in distressed communities. And so you gain a little bit of knowledge in doing it that way, but primarily as a creative placemaker. We were doing work in areas of the cities that were normally marginalized and abandoned, but giving people a real reason to move back and to participate in that cultural experience in those neighborhoods. And then inadvertently became, over time, we realized a Trojan horse for gentrification. We go and light it up. The artists and the cool people come first. Other people follow them. And then all of a sudden, if we're leasing, and normally we're leasing spaces, our landlords would say, okay, well, we really don't need you anymore. We have a coffee shop and a restaurant. Thank you for the buzz and the 10,000 people a week. But we're going to just, and then our rent goes to $4,000 or $5,000 more a month than we're making. And then they kick us out, and then we see what happens. Baltimore is, in my estimation, one of the only cities left, certainly on the East Coast, where you could actually revitalize, but without removing all the people who live there currently, so it can inure, that growth can inure to their benefit. And so when we're at a moment where we have this many people joining in a social movement, yes, by tragedy, yes, enforced by a global crisis, that now a lot of people get a chance to see what we mean when we say a very simple phrase, which should cause no controversy whatsoever, but seemingly does, to the point of actually extreme violence, that our lives matter as well. Black lives matter, just matters, as Michael Che jokes. That's controversial, just saying it matters. Baltimore has a particular advantage to address that issue more than many other places. We have neighborhoods that are close to each other with deep, deep divides. Many of these racial arrangements were developed here in Baltimore and perfected in other cities, but they were really developed here. Scientific racism was also being developed and researched and promulgated here in Baltimore at universities that are now in quite prominence. But you're arriving at a moment where you have to realize that a whole part of the population has no idea what we're talking about because they choose not to, for the most part, when you say that Black lives matter. Well, it's a shock to them. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, all lives matter. Yeah, if Black lives matter, they would, because you very specifically, in this city particularly, wrote into the code and the covenants that Black lives do not matter. Those people will not advance. And they specifically named Black and brown people as the ones who will not benefit. So then you have to address the cognitive dissonance of my hard work that has gone into creating the privilege that I have actually comes at the disadvantage of another group of people who have been marginalized, left behind, stuck in poor performing schools and decrepit neighborhoods where there's no banking, there's hardly any food that's healthy, and those kinds of things that we know, should we choose to see them. And so there are a couple of things that really have to be addressed in an area that has produced this much intellectual and social capital, but also has the readily available and visible elements of those lives very specifically not mattering. So I have a very large cadre of friends here and in very friendly organizations of all kinds, all religions, all races, phenomenal people doing very hard work. Movable Feast is certainly one of them. And so they don't have to be convinced as to why Black people, particularly in Baltimore, are so poor. It's been written into the code. It's enforced by years of practice. Long after it was illegal, that practice continues. And we see that because sometimes when I follow them back to their offices, those offices will be, the euphemism is called the majority culture, even though we are the majority, right? 70% of the population in Baltimore is Black and brown, yet 70% of the power is in other people's hands. That wasn't an accident. That was long before COVID-19. So part of the thing that I think that we have to address in order to get to not only your questions, but what is life going to be like after this enormous realization happens that actually Black lives really do matter. And they only matter if they're given full agency. And you can't give that agency to me. The only real empowerment is self-empowerment. So how do we get to the place where you are not kneeling on my neck to stop me from advancing? So we, all of us, have a responsibility towards that. But I think that I can speak for some of my friends that also feel like we have no real responsibility to reform white supremacy. It is a broken construct. It only worked for some, and now it's not working for anybody. But those systems are automatic. They don't require your permission to operate. They don't require anything other than your complicity to keep going. So how do we break the bond of that when all of that legacy of all that privilege is coming crashing to a halt? So there are a couple of things that I sort of focused on, and I'll stop right after we talk about this and open it up. And I'm going to also make a couple of recommendations for people who are serious about really delving into this realm and finding out, well, I have what I have, I know what I know, what do I do with that, how do I help? And I believe that that is a very robust layer in Baltimore. I found that to be authentic layer in Baltimore, where people really, really want to get into the business of what do we do about it? But you can't microwave that journey. You have to understand fully what it is you're addressing, and many of my allies do not. So there's a couple of themes that I want to sort of lay on the table for you that we're wrestling with right now with allies, friends, and associates, and a couple of opposers. And one of the main things is, how do you have communication with allies that might be culturally incompetent where they stand? And I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean, if I don't know anything about Polish culture and I want to shoot a film in Poland, I've got to dive into that information. Yet many of my allies, our allies, I would say, are troubled by looking at this information. I, for a while, worked with the Racial Equity Institute in North Carolina, and we found often when we were doing trainings, and I participated in many of them, that people were like, well, I just want to get to the, can we stop talking about that and just get to the problem? It's like, well, what is the problem in your estimation? And they were almost always like way, way off. So it's very important to brace yourself and dive into the information. As a man, I could not pretend that rape culture does not exist and be a father of a phenomenal daughter. I'd have to prepare her for that by understanding fully what that means. And so we're at a place where we really must start to do that. So it's very hard to maintain allyship when both sides are not at least at the same place. And that cultural incompetence can be quite deadly. And it's made manifest often here in Baltimore. So that's one. We also have to deal with the fact that we have, why are those connections between us so fraught with peril? Why are they so charged? Why is there such a third rail in this conversation? Because we also have to address that many promises over the years have been broken. If you look at after the uprising of Freddie Gray, there was a lot of action for a while, and then it fades because the commitment is not there. So you really have to get to the place where, how do I maintain my commitment to a thing that could take years? You know, the old adage is that, you have to agree to plant trees that you may not sit under the shade of. I'll be 66 on my next birthday. I don't expect a wide adoption of all lives mattering, therefore Black lives being centered in that mattering in my lifetime. But I have a daughter, and she one day will hopefully have grandchildren, and maybe in their lifetime if we get to work on this stuff now, because the current system is broken. It's going to reset itself, but it's broken right now. And then the last part that I'll stop here and try to take some questions is, what are those healing modalities that can actually put us in the vein of restoring trust? We all know that systems move at that speed, only the speed of trust. If I was making a can and we couldn't trust that it was actually going to hold the soup, that can would have to come off the line. So we can't expect that all of those hundreds of years of damage and trauma that's been done very specifically to a community, you can't swap someone else's experience out for it. You must understand what happened to the group that you are trying to address, that you're trying to free, really, because only they can free themselves. To Toni Morrison's, quote that you can talk about freedom all day long, but we have to take possession of our freed selves. In order to do that, it does require defensible space. You have to stop injuring me in order for me to heal and repair and develop a relationship with you. So those healing modalities, what are they? How do we discover and activate the process for building trust in community? So I'm going to recommend a couple of books that certainly helped me, and some of the understanding that we've come through in a journey. I would very specifically recommend Dr. Joy Leary, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It's a great book that really has a lot of workshops and things like that. She runs workshops around the country that you can participate in. And so for some of you, the information will be quite rough, things that you did not know, because here's the thing, it's not in your history books either. So more on that later. Not in My Neighborhood, of course, is an anthem that we make almost all of our staff and other allies read, because it very specifically deals with why you're seeing what you're seeing here in Baltimore. It was really designed here and kind of perfected in other cities. And a book that I've come to really, really cherish actually recently is The Color of Law, because it addresses how the federal government and other state and local governments actually enforced segregation, even in communities that were starting to become integrated. Even when we were starting to develop relationships at work or through, uneasy alliances in other environments, it insisted that if a neighborhood was more than one way or the other, and if you're going to build the suburbs as they start to be created, they were very specific covenants against not only Blacks living there. You couldn't sell to a Black person. And there was no faster way to get yourself burned out or fired than for you to actually act as any kind of an agent to help Black people rise and find a better life. Stamped from the Beginning is a phenomenal historical text to talk about the entire context of how we got to this place, as well as The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran. Stamped from the Beginning is Ibram Kendi. And How to Kill a City is also a good book by Peter Moskowitz. It's very important to understand in the place making that is important for this arena that we're going to recover and find this life after. Where do we go from here? You have to deal with the current conditions. I live in a very poor community in Baltimore, right next to a very wealthy community here in Baltimore. I'm in Marble Hill, and I'm right next door to Bolton Hill. The life expectancy in those 3 blocks drops down more than 20 years in 3 blocks. So when I hear gunshots over here, they've kind of tuned them out in the other neighborhood because it doesn't really affect them as much, even though they're right next door. But I have allies over there who deeply understand this situation, but they didn't create it, and no one person can fix it. Despite what you heard from the White House, there is no I alone that can fix it. Everybody, it requires tears, yes. You're going to be moved by this. I often warn my friends who are diving into this, it's a dark night of the soul for both of us. When we realize what happened fully, and most of us do not, even though we grew up in those environments, fully understand like how much is railed against you. And when people of the quote unquote majority culture or European cultures who have been taught all of their lives that our grandfather came here and worked really hard and started the store and came up from his bootstraps, as if those people who labored for hundreds of years and were suppressed for another 160 years, that any of their agency was either stolen, plundered, or destroyed, with very rare exception, that we're living in an environment that's actually quite a lie. And we're all coming to terms with that. The statues and the pageantry and the parades and all the rest of it. Like, what do we do when we find out it's all based on a kind of corruption? That takes strength and courage to face that and come out on the other side and create something. How do we reimagine the world that we know that we want? And I know that people authentically want that world. No one is happy that our children are begging on corners for food. So I would like to kind of like pump the brakes right there, see if there are questions that are coming in. So let's see. Angie Pie, I love these nicknames too, by the way. It's been incredibly informative, a lot of perspective. It talks a lot of, she's talking about raising white kids. It talks a lot about the trap of being raised to not see color. Very good, Angie. Thank you for that. And how that manifests over time and creates this inability to talk about race, exactly, for white people. She's highly recommending it for parents or people that interact with children. And underscoring the thing about what happens with our children is a very important moment. I've found that there are not a lot of people. You have to be particularly hardened of heart to not really care about children. Yet we can get into a kind of fatigue, right? An empathy fatigue. Those children that are on street corners that we find annoying us, trying to wash our windows, like we need our windows washed 5 times before we get out of town. They're begging for food. They're not buying Nikes. They're putting food on the table at night, sometimes for their families. And when we see them on every corner at 11 o'clock in the morning, when school is in, yet there's no powerful effort to make sure that they're provided for at home. Not really. A lot of agencies struggling hard with that, but it's overwhelming to a certain extent. So what do we do about those things when just the basics, the basic human needs, which if we were wise about those things and if we had historical context, we would realize that almost all revolutions that we've ever had, especially the violent ones, began with a famine first. And if we think that people in our city are not starving to death, we are wrong. You can't survive on Kool-Aid and cookies and Fritos and have the executive function to do coding and algebra 2 trigonometry. It's just, we know the brain science doesn't support that. So getting to that life afterwards means that you have to be courageous and somewhat rigorous enough in your own pursuit. And those conversations are not always going to be polite and they're not always going to be pretty. But people who really feel like they have something to contribute, right? Intellectual reparations is still a form of reparations, because you then have to come to terms with the fact that all of our major institutions were instituted with slave money, with money purloined from the slave trade. And the rest of the other ones came along afterwards. But all the majors that we revere almost all had their roots in slavery. I doubt that there's none that I've seen that are immune from that. And so with that sort of poison taproot, what do we do with that? And that's going to take a sort of a rigorous exploration of what we want and then working backwards from that result. So I think Baltimore has some particular advantages in that regard. The intellectual base here is rigorous. I think only Boston has more colleges and universities than we do. Yet Baltimore is never spoken about as a college town. It's spoken of as the murder capital of the world, right? Most dangerous city in America. So Pamela McCann, thank you for your question. How do we transmit that knowledge on a one-to-one basis with family and friends who refuse to hear the truth? Mark Twain has a wonderful quote that I use all the time. You never argue with an idiot. They will drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. So you have to be careful when you're dealing with someone, and I'm not using that term idiot blithely, meaning that do you sit there and argue with someone who refuses to see the truth, or do you let the truth guide you towards your actions that you take and let that inspire other people? Maybe somebody's not ready to hear the truth. Maybe they're not ready to hear that great-great-grandfather was really the chief rapist of Money, Mississippi. Maybe they're not ready for that information. So you can put it out there, make sure that you are rooted in it and keep doing that work and let that inspire. That happens in both communities, by the way. We have these misnomers that everybody loved Martin Luther King back in the day, and that is not the truth. I was a child, but I'm old enough to know that that was not so. That in certain circles, and Malcolm X, forget about it, not spoken of, because they were proposing a more radical change than people thought they were quote unquote ready for. But that demand is also always right now. People don't want to be a little bit free, they want to be completely free. And one group is allowed to individuate. What you do individually is based on how hard you work and so forth and so on. And the weird thing is, and the troubling thing is, that the disparities between Black and white people increase as their education level increases. Black and white high school students, pretty much right here. A Black and white PhD, completely different experiences. And the disparity between those two experiences is fraught with peril. If you are not independent, you can be fired too for bringing it up. And if you bring it up too often and make the council or the board uncomfortable, you will definitely be gone. And the word will go out not to hire you at the next place. So it does require courage. It requires courage and courage of conviction. And many times we've seen throughout history that's been true, that people have had to stand up for a long time. And at first they were ignored and ridiculed and mocked and scorned. And then eventually a few more people stand with them, and then it goes and goes and goes. And pretty soon it's a very broad thing. So here we are with a movement that should be very easy to understand. Yet people can get strap guns on and go to the street and start to kill you. So Ashley Tamar is asking, where are the councilmen and women? How much of this is their responsibility? And that's a very good question, Ashley. Thank you for that question. So here's the thing. All of us are responsible. All of us can be accountable. And I don't use that in terms, you won't hear me ever use the word blame, because having been raised Catholic and going to Jesuit schools all the way throughout my career, guilt is absolutely useless. Your tears don't really matter. If they don't move you to move your feet the next day, it's not important. So city council people are there as representatives of the people, and they are mashing down a bunch of competing, sometimes interests or positions, actually, trying to find out what are mutual interests. What damages that the most, because I'm not one that sort of blames them, and they're in many of the meetings I'm in, and then sometimes they have to go to 2 or 3 meetings after the meeting I'm in, that a lot of them are very hardworking people. Sometimes they get suborned into corruption, and we've seen that happen certainly in Baltimore. But their responsibility is actually to deliver something to that community. So if that community is not writing an agenda for what they want and then making sure it gets delivered on, that person goes into an arena where the entire thing is about compromise. In order to get this, you have to sign on to that. In order to get that, they have to sign on to something else. But if you don't hold them accountable, not to just come and shout at them at the city council meeting for 3 minutes, but to hold them accountable, meaning who's writing the agenda, who's informing the agenda, did you spend enough time gathering that information and putting it out there for all of them? It becomes a kind of kind of an assembly period at school. You can just sort of dial out for a little while and it'll be over before you know it. I'm not an ageist, of course, because I'm an older person myself now, so I'm not blaming older people per se. But I will say, as an older person, what I've seen in the generation that preceded me was that their basic attitude was, I got mine, you got to get yours. And that sense of not having a shared interest makes for a very ineffective politician who's doing a job that most of us would not want to do. Let's be frank. All that job is very, very difficult to do. And it's not a winning strategy. People don't call their city council person and laud them with praise. They usually have to hear complaints. And complaints are important. All great changes begin in chaos and complaint. They're not supposed to stay that way. And in my community, I've seen people complaining now for decades and only showing up to talk about the complaint. Very rarely do they have proposals. And in my office, that you're not allowed to bring up a complaint without a proposal. So if we started to take that on in a city that's just about the right size, we joke about Baltimore being small-to-more. And when I first moved here, it was kind of pejorative, this provincial place that couldn't get ahead. I use the small-to-more network every day because within 2 degrees, I can get to almost anybody. And you call 2 friends and somebody knows somebody. But if I don't make that call, if I don't follow up, and they're practiced not following up here, it sometimes would take 8 or 9 or 10 calls to get someone to respond to an email. And then I realized some people were just a little busier than I was. So I just put them on speed dial, kept dialing them. So it's not that I'm any smarter or wiser than anybody else. I just hang in there with the problems a little bit longer and get it done. So Tina Strico is sharing that she was raised prejudiced. As she grew older, she took it upon herself to not see color since she knew it was wrong growing up. And there again, we have the thing that was referred to earlier. The not seeing color is a misnomer. What you're really saying is you definitely see that I am a person of color, right? You'd have to be blind. And then you can listen for other cues even if you were blind. What we're really trying to get to is not stigmatizing it. I was very lucky growing up in a very, very multicultural neighborhood, racially mixed and so on and so on. And so sometimes I say to people that, when they're talking about these various things that, well, I've been Black actually a long time. And then somebody asked me one day, well, what do you mean by that? Meaning that Black was not stigmatized for me until I went to an all-white school. In my neighborhood, I have Black friends, white friends. My best friend growing up was Filipino and a very large Black family. I'm the oldest of 14 kids. My father's one of 10, so there were a lot of Robinsons around. But when the environment flipped, I was first one of 20 Black kids in a school with 200 or 300 people in it. And by the time I graduated, there were 2. That it became so racially hostile so quickly that I started to realize, oh, you are stigmatizing something that I see literally when I go home, it's going to be celebrated and we're just going to be out there and not talking about, we're really glad we're Black. It was just merely we rolled it along. But the idea that you should not see my color means that the words are wrong, right? Definitely see me. You want to know about the magnificence of being a Black person in America, ask someone who's really, really into their culture. I can talk about it ad nauseum, as my friends will tell you. I have a lot of soapboxes that I'm on. So that's the important point, though, in what you're just mentioning there is that it's a form of child abuse to bring a child up to be a bigot, to be quote unquote prejudiced. Children don't do that naturally. They'll play with anybody that's fun. And even the kids who aren't that much fun will join in if they think they're really welcome in that group. So you have to see that. Someone has to see that and crush that out of that person so that you have an adult that has grown up in an environment where they've been lied to use Malcolm's term, they've been bamboozled. They've been run amok. And so then therefore the elites get to sit back and let that other probably person of not a lot of means, often it's happened inside of that environment. And we've seen that throughout history, going all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion. We were starting to knit together. We're like, oh, those elites are really cleaning all of our clocks. And then Bacon's Rebellion set up the context of race in America. How do we reward these groups so they see more affinity with me, even though I'm indenturing them and keeping them tied to the whipping post, how do we make them align with us? We'll promise something special just from pigmentation. Whiteness wasn't the thing. They were French, they were British, they were Polish, they were German, da da da. And you know, if you're any student of history, they made war on each other relentlessly for 1,000 years in Europe and killed villages with women and children in it with no problem whatsoever. And then came here and continued to perpetuate that slaughter. But the Bacon's Rebellion freaked them out because they're like, oh, so we got to create something that makes them have affinity with us. And they created a sense of, when you come here, you're going to be white and they're going to be black. And they enforced it by making sure that the punishment for that rebellion was permanent enslavement for the black ones and additional indentured servitude for the white ones. Sorry, there's always something going on over here. So anyway, that's where we are. And so you have to sort of, again, white people and black people have to take possession of their freed self. So Imani is asking, how do we get the white people who actually want to help to actually understand where their prejudices are and where they still remain? I notice a lot of reading lists, but not as many doing lists that seem to be fear-based, at least partially. And that's a very good point, Imani. So I think that what's important in that is that, you know, action is the proper fruit of knowledge. I could just sit here and compile stuff and write more and get more PhDs and just sit here and just be a font of knowledge and bromides and truisms and so forth and so on. But don't ever apply it. If I get my law degree and never practice law and don't use it for anything else, it's like, well, why did you spend that much time and money doing that thing? And it's a point right now that we actually don't need the tears. We need the feet. We need the investment. We need you to take that privilege that you're going to have, that's not going to disappear in any of our lifetimes, and use it appropriately. And what I mean by that is that if it's an ill-gotten gain, and not through your own thing, you didn't go out and purposely hurt someone, then when you know a thing has been harmed, then you are supposed to do something about it. That is in the design of human beings. People are generally at their best when things are worse. That's why you'll see 5 people get together and lift the burning car off the person. We are moved to act as human beings, to look after each other, because that's our first tribe, right, as humans. When we meet on the trading route, we don't always make war with each other. It's like, I have this, oh, you put that in yours? I didn't know that. That tastes pretty good. Then you start to share things. That's our basic nature. This other thing is an artificially placed thing, but it's enforced, as we've seen, as we have to say, now we've got to get the police free themselves, because believe me, there are killer cops in there. And some of those people returning from war or just, have heard all their lives that those people are the problem. And when they put on the power and the authority of that uniform, they are not there to protect and to serve those people. They are there to police an enemy population. And all of us have to be accountable and responsible for that, because as it says, and then they came for me. So, but I don't discourage people from learning. This information is valuable. Know what it is you're trying to address. And then you can get to the place of using the science of, there's another really great book that I'm using right now. It's called Getting to Yes, Negotiating Without Giving In, and without essentially giving up your principles. You find out what people's interests are versus just, this is my position. And both sides need to be better with that. Both sides need better communication. If I really want you to do a thing, do I shame you and stop you? Or do I try to develop that to get you to come and see things my way, and then maybe I can see things your way. We can find out where to meet in the middle. If you really intend to do a thing, some of us that are doing the building part are really predisposed to the thing that we do. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I look at a crappy neighborhood and I go, well, there could be a park there, it could be a stadium there, so and so, and we start designing, and we start doing something. And sometimes just cleaning up. What a great opportunity we're offered by COVID-19. In order to address a pandemic, you know what the first thing you have to do? You have to clean that puppy up, like to the bones, right to the structure. You cannot put something new on top of all that degradation. When we see those terms about how many people have died already, 180,000 plus people, and you also hear a statistic that 50 to 70% of those people are black and brown. Well, we're not seeing the names and the neighborhoods really in those numbers, but they're there, and we're getting ready to enter the winter, and a lot of those people are going to huddle up, and some things are going to get really, really worse. But we also know, anybody who's ever built anything, that's always almost darker before the dawn. So we have to get to that place. So I'm going to answer another question here. Greg Rainier is writing, where do we begin? What level? He belongs to several groups who try to help from the ground up. They tutor in pre-K and K, yet those inner city children come to us already broken at 4 or 5. They know swearing and screaming. How do we reach them? Well, of course, you can't reach children without reaching their parents. Great question, because that's the frustration. I know Greg personally, and I know he's in those neighborhoods doing that work every day. And imagine how frustrating it is for them, because you don't have a magic wand to keep. Now, if we saw a baby floating in the water, we would jump in, of course, and rescue. We wouldn't go, is that a white baby or a brown baby? Do I care? You would jump in the water and rescue that child. But if 15 more babies came floating down the river, you would have to investigate who's throwing babies in the water. So you'd have to go upstream and find out what that is. Understanding how a child in pre-K is in a household, not in a safe, comfy place where people are reading and telling stories, which is what it's supposed to be, that you have to investigate what kind of life their parents are having, and how do we get to the place where those parents were not parented well. And that is information that is available, it is true, and it's been ignored. And many times it's going to have a string that ties to things that's going to make you very uncomfortable. People that you were told to revere. I'm old enough to remember the crack epidemic the day before it and the day after. And I have to fly when I'm in DC out of an airport named for the person who set up a system so that that drug flooded neighborhoods all across America, and yet he's revered sometimes as a saint, with no complicity for that act that is now proven to have happened just in order to do some other kind of politically expedient thing. The damage from that removed a generation of parents. And so those those kids in 2nd and 3rd grade, their parents were away. And we're still wrestling with the issues around that right now. Over incarceration, racial control, barriers in every lane you can think of, except for entertainment and sports if you want to play or run. Not if you want to own it. A lot of people on this call can tell you about those things too. So knowing that makes no difference whatsoever. So Greg's question is the most important one. Does he do that work by himself? Are those kids being fed? Going back to movable feasts, essential work. They make sure, unbeknownst to most of us, that people who would ordinarily be starving to death get a meal, get a visit. Often that's the only visit they have. And they do this in extraordinary ways, so much so that we had to come there and see, how in the world are you serving that many meals? So there's great organizations around that are a part of a sea of change that you would not believe. Baltimore has so many of them, it's actually, you couldn't shake a stick out here without hitting them. They're everywhere, doing phenomenal work, impossible work. But do they need more resources? Absolutely. Can they use more money? Absolutely. You know, Baltimore has a kind of a math problem, right? The things that would normally be in the tax base, because they purposefully damaged the housing market for specific people a long time ago. So you now have about 40% of your population locked into abject poverty for the next 75 years. So do you think Baltimore will ever do well if 40% of the population is starving to death every day? You will not. I'm not really good at math, but I'm that good. I've got it. So we have to get to the place where we can move that forward. There's another question coming in. How do we act and evolve a police force when there is a crooked fraternal order police who continues to protect and glorify racist behavior? We can elect new sheriffs, but FOPs and the president of the FOP regularly control the tone of the police force. Is there something that can be done in Baltimore? The answer is, of course, yes. Something can always be done. You can support the leadership that you have. You can insist that just because no one's ever pulled you out of a car and beat you up for having a broken traffic light, that you pay attention when it's happening to other people. and then show up. What happened after? It wasn't just George Floyd, it was Arbery, Breonna, and George Floyd happening all in one period of time. Arbery's murderers had killed him months before and were at home. Now, who can tell me that they think that if I did that, chased down somebody in my truck and killed them on camera, and they had that video, that I'd be out just eating a sandwich and walking around and talking about stuff? I'd be in jail that evening. We're held accountable. They are not. So to the point of FOP, yes, that is a troubling place, and there's many places of resistance. When you have a freedom movement, and if you study them, there's almost always a swing in the other direction. But it does rely on complicity, right? It does rely on people going to sleep about hitting the snooze button. Well, you know, Officer JoJo is always nice to me, so he seems like a nice guy. But that killer cop that the FOP is protecting often is not able to be touched by his own command. So then the command gets the blame instead of FOP. So we have to look at that being something that actually we pay for the police. FOP does not. They're a union. Their job is to protect their members. And sometimes their members need protection. Everybody out here in the streets are not good. Trust me. When I need somebody over here, I do not call the homeboys around the corner. I call 911. But I don't expect to be murdered when they're coming. If I was in distress myself or had a family member that was having a mental health crisis, we have to ask, why are we sending a guy with a gun to address a mental health crisis? Nurse practitioners do it every day. They don't kill anybody in those hospitals, generally. I'm generalizing. So we have to trouble those. We have to investigate when we see something that's not quite right, because we pay for those officers. Black people also pay for those officers and can't call them or can't trust them when it comes to help me with my crisis in my house, that he's not going to shoot my daughter or my son because they're having a mental health crisis or a drug addiction crisis or whatever that is. So we have to get to that. And so, yes, when you're saying defund the police, we don't mean we don't need police departments. We don't need murderous ones. We don't need police departments that are going, the jobs that they are doing could actually be better handled by, I don't know, maybe funding the schools fully, so that the teacher, Mrs. Johnson, doesn't have to use her own money to feed the kids or buy books or paper. Those are things that we know. These are facts. And yet we go on as if, well, somebody else will handle that problem. So it does require feet and hands. Mind, yes, but it does require showing up. We can adopt schools. We can help the Gregs of the world do that work with those young children. There's always something that can be done. And we have this great city that people are moved to do that. So I love being here and doing that. Okay, so someone also asked, what should employers be focusing on to improve their workplaces? This is a great question. And address issues that may be not spoken about loudly. I'm fortunate enough to have been the boss in my own environments for more than 20 years. So it's a very good question. If I am tolerant of jokes about gay people and women in the workforce, and in the lunch counter and so on and so on, no boss can tell me, unless he's got 17,000 employees scattered around the world, that he doesn't know those things as a part of the culture. And culture trumps policy. All of them have mission statements. We do this, and we are open and inclusive, blah, 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 right? They all do that. Yet every day, a woman or a trans woman or a gay employee or someone has to defend themselves in court and generally get booted out while that's happening. And any of their defenders booted out as well. But in that cultural shift that happens, it used to be okay to tell a gay joke around the water cooler. It used to be okay to say certain words in the workplace. If the workplace is not safe for the worker and a promising, wholesome, productive environment for the worker, really how much mileage am I getting out of that person I'm paying for? So the leadership has to provide a place where that is so much part of the culture that it's unacceptable. Like you can tell those jokes if you want to, you just can't work for me. But at the same time, you don't wait for leadership. Many changes come from the bottom up. The best ones I find come from the middle and from the ends towards the middle. People are generally closer to the problem generally have better solutions, at least to be able to offer a proposal from them. Well, how are you being harmed? Well, what's going on? What is in that environment that makes you less than productive? And if we looked at that as a loss of productivity to actually support that other thing that we know is undermining people, because I'm paying for both employees, that's just stupid to allow those things to continue. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of a clubhouse, right? We're just a bunch of boys getting together and, making crazy stacks of paper. But most companies today, that's not true. A lot of companies today also have a double bottom line. They want their employees to have a good life because it costs a lot to cultivate them and train that employee and provide them with all that stuff. And if I didn't even care about people and only cared about my money, isn't it better to make sure that each of those people in the environment are able to work at their best? So that's a kind of a consciousness and enlightenment that sounds good until you have two opposing interests. You don't really know what happened, and you're supposed to have this Solomon-like experience and cut the baby in half. But I promise you that if you insist on a culture of productivity, consciousness, and all the rest of that, we find, you don't have to listen to me, there's studies that are done on this, those companies over time do better. It's not perfect, and you won't get there every time. So that sense of the perfect not being allowed to become the enemy of the good is also important. Well, we got this far, and then we're going to improve that process and we're going to get a little bit better. And it's continually improving, and eventually people relax. They're like, okay, we're having a better experience. Imani is lying. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Imani Leonza? Maybe, I'm almost right. I'm a Black woman, and I've been relatively recently let go out of nowhere for, I hope this is not true, but you wouldn't be lying here, not looking happy. So, first of all, they did you a favor. Anybody that would say something that's stupid, you're probably in the wrong environment anyway. So sometimes I've been fired a couple of times for insubordination. Go figure. Anybody who knows me know that's easily the easiest reason that they would fire me. But in that firing, I found over time that it actually propelled me to do something else. So if you're not fired for cause, I don't believe there's any job description unless you work as a clown. Not looking happy is a measure of success at the office. But people will do horrendous things to not be made to feel uncomfortable. And Imani, you appear to be a young person, and let an older person tell you that you have a long pathway ahead of you. And if you're not happy, there's no, you're not required to just put on the mask. Find a place that values you for what you do. That question kind of disappeared really fast, so I didn't get to see it. So if you could put that back up. Okay, there we go. Besides the fact that Reagan wouldn't address HIV and contributed to the crack epidemic, Franny, was there a previous part of that? Because it seems like it's a continuation, but that's exactly the truth. That was an older comment. There are things that we know now, and we cannot pretend that we don't know them. We can't pretend that we don't know. It's getting warmer. There's a lot more relationships across racial and cultural lines. Baltimore is a prime example of it. A lot of the population that's coming here for our colleges and universities is not just white people from the Midwest. They're coming from all over the world. And that offers an extraordinary opportunity. People sometimes coming here from all over the world really know what poverty is. They might be a part of an elite in their country as well, where people are also being allowed to starve because they are a part of some other group that somebody doesn't like. This is not a white American invention. They came here with it intact, and many other groups came here with these things intact because it's essentially kind of a tribalism. But when we're free to choose who our new tribe is, when we're free to put people in our social circle, in our other circle, that are there because we have an affinity with them, we can also notice who's not there, who's not included. Why are we in a city that's 70% Black and I have an all-white board? It's a legitimate question. If you're realizing that, wow, maybe we're missing out on a marketplace that's here. Maybe we're missing out on a growth strategy that's here. Maybe we're missing out on just new customers that are here. But if they're all broke, they won't be such good customers. So it takes a longer approach sometimes. It does take a more a patient approach on both sides to build that kind of a culture that people are appreciating. I'm not talking about some idyllic, Camelot kind of thing. People get mad and things happen and people say things that are not appropriate. But I think that we can reach a place where we start to realize that if you want to get something done, then just stopping at the emotion about what we're going to do and what we should be doing is one way to approach it. Generally leads to a lot of conversation and hurt feelings. And those feelings have to be repaired, and you're still not building anything. You're still not doing anything. To a producer and a developer, we want to build something. We want to grow something. Because what I have found when I was producing, I've produced about maybe 70 plays. And if I'm setting up and doing a play in a city, I've got to have every butt that has $50 to sit in that seat. So I want everybody to come, right? So I have to figure out different messaging for different market segments and blah, 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 so on and so on. What if we looked at the growth of a city like Baltimore, where everybody was kind of sort of fed, schools were generally well provisioned, those jobs that are going wanting just because someone doesn't have a master's degree, plumbers and electricians make quite a lot of money. And we took all that stuff out of the schools. We took art out of the schools. We took music out of the schools. When we knew for 30 years that music improves math scores, that stuff is known. And we let it go. So the sense of shared purpose, the sense of shared experience, to share strength and so forth and so on, it's literally in the work of movable feast from the very beginning. And many other organizations that not only use them as a model, but have exemplary programs that they do of their own. But we have to get into the bottom line. Ashley is also contributing that communication is vital. But where are the councilmen and women? Are they not seeing this? Are they financially not at all willing to allocate funds? And again, Ashley, very good question, because they are our most immediate representatives. And some of them may be on this call. I deal with people in city council all day long, all week long. And many of them are working very hard. A lot of the ones that weren't willing to work that hard, we wave bye-bye to them, because we want in that job, if you don't want to do that job, that's fine. And we can have the same conversation about the police department. City council takes that money that's gathered and allocates it to certain things. If you want to hold them accountable, you have to go to those meetings. Especially now, we would normally have to gather, right? And now we can't gather for a little while. So if you're not on a technological platform, you're not going to know what's happening. You're not going to get the invite. You're not going to get any of those other kinds of things. We have to really be prepared to understand why neighborhoods right next to each other, one has all the broadband it needs, and this one, I'm lending my broadband to my next door neighbor so they can do their homework. And that only goes so far. So Ashley is actually correct in looking at it's the old adage also, if you want to know what my values are, I show you my budget, right? Well, are you there for what is now participatory budgeting processes so that you can really see? Freedom of Information Acts have given you access to everything, but it is a lot of work. It may be work after your work that has to be done, and you have to kind of care about what's happening to my next door neighbors, because my broadband alone won't fix what they're going through, and it won't fix everything that's happening here in this neighborhood, but it's a beginning of knowing what's happening in the neighborhood. If I wanted to build here, I had to find out, what am I addressing? It's not just buildings that are decrepit. How did they get that way? Why are there so many of them? Why do we allow that to continue? That tree growing out of the roof has been growing for 25 years. And that's right next door to things that are shiny and beautiful. So we have to trouble those things and be bold enough to address and accept the answers that come back from that. So it is a certain amount of holding people accountable, but sometimes with love, right? If I see that city council person, and I know they've just been through a hard fight, I don't have to start from bump all that, here's my problem. I can say, man, you look tired. Are you going to take a vacation? You can take a break? Okay, so I'm glad to hear that, but here's my agenda. What do you want me to do? How do I help you do this? And any good politician will tell you, you have to make them do it. There's too much stuff going on, and they may need you to come down to city council when they need you to say, I'm speaking for my constituency and they're here. Stand up. So that they know in the rest of that room, this guy is not just making stuff up, or this woman is not just doing something just for some friends of hers in a sorority circle. It's a lot of work to do this stuff as a society, but that's what we're designed for. So the great part is we already have everything that we need to do that work. Baltimore is an extraordinary city, and I've been lucky enough to live in many of them, but I've met some of the most phenomenal people in my life in this town. And Baltimore is also international news. What we do here gets known and matters. And yes, at the end of the day, all lives will matter only when, fill in the blank. If everybody doesn't have justice, and as Brian Stevenson says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. We should realize that you don't really have a justice system. You have something designed to protect one group and harm another, not kind of, sort of, purposefully. And if we don't hold that system accountable, the other side will never be truly privileged, will never be truly happy. You won't have any peace at all. Revolutions begin in hungry bellies. So we have an extraordinary opportunity to take this current crisis that has broken many of those legacy systems, and a lot of this information is available, so it's no need, everything ever written about all this stuff will pop up in your iPhone. But you have to get into that information, and you have to see things and agree to address them. So we're winding down here. Is there any other last, I'm not trying to be Treebeard here. I'm just trying to, by the way, this is, I'm just saying that get involved, call someone, call a friend, dial in, bring some donuts, and then come on down and get it done, because this is a great town to get involved in. The problems are real. The problems are serious, but so are you. So is your agency, so is your power, so is your intelligence, so is your heart. That's how everything changes. If you look throughout history, it's only people who said, that's not fair. A 3-year-old will tell you that. That's not fair. That's not good. That's not just. I saw you choke that guy to death on television. That's not going to work anymore. As we saw, our children came out in the street and said, no, we get it now. Black Lives Matter. So thank you, everybody, for participating. I hope you'll continue to support the work of Movable Feast. And if you want to come over and help to build some houses, we're always welcome. I will make sure I put up my number someplace, and I can help connect people to the many organizations in this town that do this work. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Franny.